Maisie Williams explains why the final seasons of Game of Thrones needed to be shorter. Note: I'm reviewing Game of Thrones from the perspective of someone who has read all of George R.R. Martin's novels, while my colleague David Mlitz, who hasn't read the books, will be writing straight recaps. His write-up of Episode 7, The Dragon and the Wolf, will appear at the Post-style blog. This post discusses the events of the August 27 episode of Game of Thrones in detail. You can find my recaps of every prior episode of the show here. Readers have reported some problems with the links from Think Progress. We're doing our best to get them fixed. Can't get enough Game of Thrones? My Washington Post chat here will run a supersized 2 hours, starting at 1 p.m. on Monday so that we can discuss the finale. The best moment in the 7th season of Game of Thrones came during the Spoils of War, when the destructive power of Daenerys Targaryen's, Emilia Clarke, dragons was put on dramatic display in an episode that made it impossible to ignore the human cost of that power. In The Dragon and the Wolf, Game of Thrones closed out its penultimate season with an episode that amped up both the human drama and a very special effect, but in a way that couldn't quite bridge the gap between them. It was the fitting conclusion to a frustrating season of this series, which pulled far-flung characters together, dispersed them again to confusing effect and dropped plenty of tantalizing information, only to treat us as if we weren't smart enough to figure it all out for ourselves. I felt horribly tense throughout this episode of Game of Thrones, but for the first time, I felt as though the series was undermining the potential of George R.R. Martin's novels rather than giving them the lean, mean edit that was revealing their best qualities. I suppose we should get this out of the way first. Despite the existential threat I know they represent, I'm underwhelmed by the Night King, Vladimir Furdik, and his army of the dead, and I suppose I have been since at least the 5th season, when I was supposed to be wowed by the battle at Hardhome and found myself longing for the skeletons from Jason and the Argonauts instead. What has long made the conflicts on Game of Thrones interesting is that the people on each side have a point, or at least an understandable rationale for what's driving them. Ned Stark, Sean Bean, was motivated by honor; Cersei Lannister, Lena Headey, by survival; Daenerys by a longing for home; Petyr Baelish, Aidan Gillen, by decades of resentment and ambition; Tyrion Lannister, Peter Dinklage, by his father's degradation and abuse; Arya Stark, Maisie Williams, by the dream of escaping her fate as a lady; Mance Rayder, Kieran Hines, by his desire to unite the free folk even if that meant fundamentally changing who they were, and so on. Though we've learned over the course of the show that the Night King was the product of one of those desperate, understandable drives, the children of the forest struggled to survive against invaders. His forces represent a pure, mindless, animal force. There's no one to root for there. Just special effects to goggle at. Or not goggle at. In this case, the undead Viserion seemed like a major step back for the show's special effects. It's true that the Army of the Dead brings out interesting tensions among our human characters, but that means there's only interesting tension on one side of the conflict, instead of on all sides as there was in past seasons and earlier in this season. Now that the final confrontation in the series has arrived, I'm dreading it less because of any particular fears about who might die and in what fashion, but because I don't actually particularly enjoy watching the version of Game of Thrones that just pits a lot of CGI against our plot-armored heroes. The Night King versus everyone takes away the agonizing choices Theon Greyjoy, Alfie Allen, spoke about in this episode. Humanity versus zombies has none of the complexity of Stark versus Greyjoy, even if that latter choice was never really a choice at all. Of course, the name of George R.R. Martin's series is A Song of Ice and Fire, so I always knew it was going to come to this. But it's still frustrating for the show to get us there in a way that makes a close reading of the books feel foolish. I've argued before that it's wrong to try to solve stories that are still unfolding in front of you. But there's a difference between spinning out wild theories about Gendry's, Joe Dempsey, parentage or brands, Isaac Hempstead Wright, time travel abilities and trying to understand a world where the rules appear to be changing along with the characters who have to live in this world and navigate its new rules. The Night King's sudden ability to bring down the wall with a reanimated dragon corpse undoes all the work both the novels and the series did to explain the magic that held it up, and the rules that could be broken or the horns that could be blown to bring it down. Explaining Jon Snow's, Kit Harington, Aegon Targaryen, origins in an info dump that is a recapitulation of information Gilly, Hannah Murray, discovered earlier, and a sudden, more systematic use of Bran's powers tosses aside a plot development that could have taught us more about how the Targaryens and dragons are connected. If this is the way these events were always meant to play out, that is what it is. But these are choices that tend to invalidate careful reading and investment in the characters' own investigations. Rather than deepen the world of Game of Thrones, choices such as these make it a universe where anything can happen. That makes it less magical rather than more. It's a place where plot convenience rather than a well-developed system of magic or godly power has been at work in ways that all make sense. I know that a lot of you come to these recaps for thematic analysis rather than for obsessive parsing of differences between Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. But when the show plays out this way, it's frustrating because it weakens the logic of the thematic investment we make in the series. If this is really about ice dragons and not about how to survive and be a decent person in a world that wants to take your best qualities and twist them, then I'm not entirely sure why I'm doing this. Of course, there was a lot of thematic development in this episode, some of which made the case for the extra long run times we're told will be the norm in the final season of Game of Thrones, and some of which didn't. Most satisfying was the juxtaposition between the healing of a sibling relationship in the north and the fracturing of one in the south. All season long, some audiences have been complaining about the seeming rift between Arya and Sansa Stark. Sophie Turner. To me, the friction felt painful and earned. These are two people who were separated at a moment when their differences were most irreconcilable, and those differences served to drive them further apart and into their own separate hells. I don't think the reveal that Arya and Sansa were pulling a con on Littlefinger entirely undoes that work. After all, their deception wouldn't have worked if he, and we, weren't willing to believe that Sansa might still be selfish enough to covet a crown and that Arya might have had her perspective so narrowed that even her sister could seem like the enemy. But in coming together to eliminate a powerful enemy, and to perform justice in the way their father taught them, Sansa and Arya proved him, and the audiences who read their characters in such broad strokes, wrong. Arya, it turns out, recognizes Sansa's strength, and the fact that her sister's particular set of skills might have helped her survive tortures that could have broken Arya. Sansa in turn can see her sister's strength and sense of right and wrong under all those qualities she still finds strange and annoying. Sansa may be a slow learner, as she acknowledges during Baelish's sentencing. But both sisters learned. In King's Landing, however, none of the Lannisters seem capable of absorbing new lessons. Their characters are still fixed into the positions they were when the series began. Tyrion is still defined by his primal trauma, his treatment by the father he murdered. Cersei is still obsessively fixed on preserving her family, both as she defines family and as she defines preservation, to the exclusion of all else. And Jaime Lannister, Nikolaj Coster-Waldau, though he still loves his brother, is so enthralled to Cersei that he can't see that she might treat even him as expendable. There is some unfortunately muddy writing in this section of the episode, which even the strong acting by all three relevant principals can't quite remedy. It's not clear to me if Tyrion betrayed Daenerys and Jon once he learned that Cersei was pregnant. It's a possible reading of those events, but not a definite one. I'm also not entirely sure what Jaime intends to do by riding north, or why Cersei would let him go unless it's part of some larger game that she and Tyrion are playing. If the dragon and the wolf was going to spend this much time fracturing the Lannisters for good and all, and to such good effect, I wish it had set them up for the next season more clearly. Other reconciliations don't work quite as cleanly. In the Dragon Pit, Sandor Clegane, Rory McCann, seemed to set up the confrontation with his brother, half-third Julius Bjornsson, that fans have been imagining for years, but the episode could have done that with a mere glance and recoil, rather than with a chest-bumping monologue that served mostly to keep hype alive, not to advance that final meeting in any meaningful way. Theon and Jon's conversation in the throne room at Dragonstone was a nice, melancholy note, and it set up the idea that Jon himself will have to reconcile his Targaryen blood and his Stark upbringing someday. That said, I'm not sure I really needed to see Theon go out and redeem himself by beating to death a minor character as proof that he has the vim and vigor to go out and seek after his kidnapped sister Yara, Gemma Whelan. Toward the end of a show like Game of Thrones, the investment in characters like Sandor Clegane and Bronn, Jerome Flynn, starts to pay off, but underdevelopment of characters like Yara and her uncle Euron, Pylu Aspect, shows more bluntly, too. And the coupling implied by the title of this episode lacked either the fire of true passion or the ice of genuine manipulation. Dany and Jon have always felt more like a foregone conclusion than a genuinely natural pairing, and in getting them together, Game of Thrones leaned heavily on the comparison to Jon's own parents, rather than on the inevitable friction between the two once they learn that Jon's claim to the Iron Throne supersedes Dany's. A romance this supposedly tragic needs to be much more swooningly romantic and to be charged with doom sharper than a bit of late-coming exposition delivered in both flashback and voiceover. That scene shouldn't have been a respite, instead, it ought to have been a harbinger of doom.